In 1997, three men almost sold a fully operational Soviet military submarine to one of the most violent drug cartels on the planet. The price was $5.5 million. The deal was nearly done. The paperwork existed. The submarine existed. The only thing standing between that moment and one of the most catastrophic weapons transfers in criminal history was a handful of federal agents who almost didn't catch it in time. This is not a movie. This is not a rumor. This is not one of those stories that gets exaggerated over time until it barely resembles reality. Every single detail you are about to hear is documented, recorded, tried in a federal courtroom, and confirmed on tape. The men at the center of this story were not shadowy figures operating from underground bunkers. One of them owned a strip club in Miami. He threw parties. He had friends in the music industry. He was funny, charming, and completely visible. Another one was a Cuban national with ties to government intelligence. The third was a direct link to the Cali Cartel, the organization that, at its peak, controlled over 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. These three men, in the wreckage of the collapsed Soviet Union, looked at a world that had suddenly lost all its rules, and they saw an opportunity. They were right that the opportunity existed. They were wrong to think they could pull it off. How does a Russian mob boss, a Cuban intelligence operative, and a Colombian cartel representative end up sitting together negotiating the price of a Cold War military vessel? How does a strip club in Miami become the nerve center of one of the most audacious criminal conspiracies in American history? How close did this actually get to working? That story starts in the winter of 1991, in the moment the Soviet Union stopped existing, and the chaos that followed made everything that came next not just possible but almost inevitable. Stay with me, because nothing in this story is what it looks like at first. And every time you think you understand where it's going, it goes somewhere else entirely. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you found this channel for the first time through this video, hit subscribe if that sounds like something you want more of. Now let's go back to where this all began, December 1991, and the moment the world changed in ways that almost nobody was prepared for. On Christmas Day in 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev sat down in front of a television camera inside the Kremlin and resigned as president of a country that, by the time he finished speaking, would no longer exist. The red flag with the hammer and sickle that had flown over the Kremlin for nearly 70 years was lowered. The Russian tricolor went up in its place. And just like that, the Soviet Union, one of the two most powerful nations in the history of human civilization, was gone. That sentence sounds clean when you read it. The reality was anything but. The Soviet Union, at its peak, covered 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. It spanned 11 time zones. It had the largest standing military force on the planet. It had nuclear weapons in the tens of thousands. It had submarines, aircraft carriers, tanks, chemical stockpiles, biological research facilities, and military hardware of every description spread across 15 republics, dozens of military installations, and thousands of square kilometers of territory that was now, overnight, either ungoverned or governed by newly independent states that had absolutely no experience running a country. Think about what that actually means. Think about a military base somewhere in Kazakhstan or Ukraine or the newly independent Baltic states. Think about the soldiers stationed there. They are still showing up for duty on December 26th. They still have their weapons. They still have their equipment. But the country that gave them their orders no longer exists. The chain of command has been severed. The paychecks, which were already irregular and often worth almost nothing because of hyperinflation, have become even more uncertain. The ideology that told them why they were serving has collapsed along with the system that promoted it. What do you do? What does a soldier do? What does a military officer do? What does a base commander do when the nation they swore allegiance to simply ceases to be? Some stayed loyal. Some transferred their allegiance to the new Russian Federation. Some transferred to their newly independent home states. And some, a critical, dangerous some, looked at the arsenal around them and made a different calculation entirely. To understand why Operation Odessa was possible, you have to understand what happened to ordinary Russian people in the early 1990s. Because this isn't just background. This is the engine that drove everything. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Russian economy didn't just slow down. It didn't experience a recession in the way Western countries understand that word. Cratered, fell off a cliff. The ruble, the Soviet currency, lost value so fast that people's life savings became worthless in a matter of months. A person who had saved carefully for 30 years, who had been responsible and disciplined and done everything right, woke up one morning and discovered that the money in their bank account could no longer buy a week's worth of groceries. This is not a metaphor. This is what happened to millions of people. Inflation in Russia in 1992 ran at over 2,500% annually. To put that in terms anyone can understand, if something cost 1 ruble in January, it cost 26 rubles by December. And salaries were not keeping pace. State workers, teachers, doctors, military personnel, they were still being paid in nominal terms, but the purchasing power of those wages had collapsed to almost nothing. At the same time, the state-controlled economy was being rapidly privatized. But the privatization process was not clean or fair or democratic. It was chaotic, opaque, and captured almost immediately by people who had connections, resources, or simply the willingness to use violence to take what they wanted. State assets worth billions, factories, oil fields, mines, real estate, were transferred to private hands for fractions of their value in transactions that were technically legal but practically indistinguishable from theft. The people who emerged from this process enormously wealthy became known as oligarchs. They are still a feature of Russian life today. But below the oligarchs, in the streets, in the neighborhoods, in the collapsing industrial cities where the factories had shut down, ordinary people were desperate in a way that is very difficult to convey to someone who has never experienced genuine economic collapse. And into that desperation walked organized crime, moving faster than any government response, moving faster than any international aid package, moving into every vacuum that the collapsing state left behind. The Russian criminal underworld did not appear from nowhere in 1991. It had existed for decades under the Soviet system, tolerated, managed, sometimes even used by the state as a kind of parallel enforcement structure. The Soviet government had its own relationship with organized crime, and it was complicated. But the collapse of the state removed whatever constraints had kept organized crime within certain boundaries. What emerged in the early 1990s is known in Russian as the Bratva, which translates literally to the Brotherhood. In Western media, this gets called the Russian mob or the Russian mafia, though the structure is different from the Italian-American Cosa Nostra in important ways. The Bratva is not a single unified organization. It is a collection of criminal groups, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing, bound together by shared culture, shared code, and shared ethnic or regional identity, rather than by a single hierarchical structure. Within the Bratva, there is a concept of vorvi zakon, thieves-in-law. These are the most senior, most respected criminal figures in the Russian underworld. Being a vor is not just about being powerful. It is about status. It is earned through years of criminal activity, tested loyalty, and adherence to a code that governs behavior within the criminal world. A vor is like a made man in the Italian-American mob, but the concept is older, more culturally embedded, and in many ways more severe. The vori, the plural, carry real authority within the criminal hierarchy. They adjudicate disputes. They set the terms of major criminal operations. They are treated with a deference that borders on reverence within their world. And in the chaos of post-Soviet Russia, their authority filled spaces that the legitimate government could no longer reach. This is the world that produced Ludwig Feinberg. This is the atmosphere in which the Bratva went from being a contained, if dangerous, feature of Russian society to an expanding global criminal network with operations in Europe, Israel, and most importantly for our story, the United States. To understand how Russian organized crime reached American shores, you have to understand Brighton Beach. And to understand Brighton Beach, you have to understand that emigration from the Soviet Union, particularly of Jewish citizens, had been happening since the 1970s, with major waves in the late 1970s and early 1980s as Soviet exit policies briefly loosened. Many of these immigrants settled in a neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, along the Atlantic Ocean, where the cheap housing and close-knit community created the conditions for a distinctly Soviet immigrant culture to take hold. Brighton Beach became known as Little Odessa, a reference to the Ukrainian port city that was, and remains, one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the former Soviet space. The neighborhood had Russian restaurants, Russian bookstores, Russian-language newspapers. It had the feeling of a transplanted Soviet city block, dropped into the edge of Brooklyn. And into this community, alongside the legitimate immigrants, the hardworking families, the people who had left everything behind to build a new life, came the criminals. Because the criminals were also Soviet immigrants. They spoke the same language. They knew the same cultural codes. And in Brighton Beach, they could operate with a degree of invisibility that they would not have had anywhere else in America. The FBI was almost entirely unprepared for this. In the early 1990s, the Bureau's organized crime resources were overwhelmingly focused on the Italian-American Cosa Nostra. The Gambino family, the Genovese family, the Lucchese family, these were the organizations that had been studied, infiltrated, and prosecuted for decades. The FBI had fluent Italian speakers, deep cultural knowledge, and established networks of informants in the Italian-American criminal world. The Russian mob? Barely a blip on the radar. There were almost no Russian-speaking agents. There was almost no institutional knowledge of how the Bratva operated, how it was structured, who the key figures were. The cultural codes were opaque to American law enforcement. The criminal network was growing, spreading, conducting operations that would have triggered immediate attention if conducted by a more familiar criminal organization, and doing it almost entirely unseen. This is not a criticism of the FBI. It is a structural reality about how law enforcement works. You focus on the threats you know. And the Russian mob in the early 1990s was a threat that American law enforcement was only just beginning to understand. The Brighton Beach networks had, by the early 1990s, established criminal operations across the United States. Not just in New York, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, in Philadelphia. And crucially for our story, in Miami, Florida, where the warm weather, the Latin American connections, and the particular texture of South Florida's criminal ecosystem made it a perfect operational base for a Russian mob figure who was, in every way, perfectly suited to that environment. That figure was Ludwig Feinberg, and his story is where this narrative truly begins to accelerate. Because Feinberg was not a typical criminal. He was something more specific and more dangerous. He was a criminal genius wrapped inside the personality of someone you'd want to have a drink with, who understood instinctively that the best place to hide in plain sight is at the center of a party. The stage is set. The world is broken. The opportunity is open. The men who will walk through it are about to be introduced. And when you understand who they are, you will understand exactly how something this insane almost worked. There is a photograph of Ludwig Feinberg that circulated widely during and after his criminal trial. In it, he is smiling. Not a nervous smile, not a forced smile. Not the smile of a man performing composure for the cameras. He is genuinely, completely, unself-consciously delighted. He looks like a man who is having the best time of his life. He looks, in other words, nothing like what you would imagine a man at the center of a plot to sell a Soviet military submarine to the Cali Cartel to look like. That was always his greatest weapon. Ludwig Feinberg was born in Odessa, Ukraine, then a city within the Soviet Union in 1958. Odessa is important. The city has a specific character. It is a port city, historically cosmopolitan, with a long tradition of commerce, cultural mixing, and a certain irreverence toward authority that distinguishes it from other Soviet cities. Odessans have a reputation within Russian and Ukrainian culture for being clever, quick-witted, and entrepreneurial in ways that sometimes shade into the transgressive. The humor of Odessa is famous throughout the Russian-speaking world. The city produced writers, artists, musicians, and, given its port city history and its position as a hub of trade, it also produced people who understood that the rules were always somewhat negotiable. Feinberg grew up in this environment. He was, by all accounts, smart from an early age, socially gifted, the kind of person who could walk into a room of strangers and leave an hour later having made 3 friends and 2 business contacts. These are the gifts of a natural salesman, a natural networker, and in the world Feinberg would build for himself a natural criminal entrepreneur. He emigrated from the Soviet Union in the 1980s, making his way eventually to the United States, and specifically to Miami. Miami in the late 1980s and early 1990s was in many ways the ideal city for someone like Feinberg. It was a city defined by reinvention, by the meeting of cultures, by the particular kind of energy that comes when large amounts of money flow through a place that doesn't ask too many questions about where that money came from. The cocaine trade of the 1970s and 1980s had supercharged the Miami economy in ways that were simultaneously glamorous and deeply corrupt. The city had grown accustomed to wealth appearing without obvious legitimate source. Feinberg fit perfectly. He opened a strip club in the Hialeah neighborhood of Miami called Porky's. The name is important. It is deliberately lowbrow, deliberately funny, deliberately unpretentious. It is the name of a man who is performing a specific kind of persona, the fun guy, the harmless entertainer, the strip club owner with a sense of humor about himself. It is not the name of an operation that is simultaneously serving as a hub for weapons trafficking, drug money laundering, and international organized crime connections. That was the point. Porky's became, over the course of the early 1990s, one of the most remarkable criminal nerve centers in Miami history. On the surface, it was a strip club. Loud music, dancers, alcohol, the particular kind of atmosphere that makes people feel they are somewhere that normal rules don't apply. Men came from all over Miami. They came from the music industry and the entertainment world. They came from the criminal world. They came from South American business circles that had connections to the drug trade. They came because Feinberg was there, and Feinberg made everyone feel welcome, made everyone feel special, made everyone feel like they were his personal guest. And in that environment, introductions got made. Connections got formed. Business got discussed. Not always with explicit criminal language, Feinberg was too smart for that. But deals were facilitated. Networks were extended. The club was the node through which people who needed to find each other found each other, with Feinberg as the connector. Now about the nickname, Tarzan. There are different versions of how Feinberg acquired this name, and he has told the story himself with visible pleasure. The version that has the most currency goes like this. Feinberg, who was always physically imposing and had a particular relationship with exhibitionism and physical display, once showed up to a gathering. The specifics vary depending on who's telling it. In a state of considerable undress, or performed some act of physical bravado that struck the assembled company as primal and unhinged in a way that recalled the famous vine-swinging ape man. The name stuck, and Feinberg embraced it completely because the name did something very useful for him. It made him seem like a character, a personality, someone whose behavior was entertaining and larger than life, rather than someone whose behavior should be examined carefully. The most dangerous criminals in history are rarely the ones who seem scary. The most dangerous criminals in history are the ones who seem fun. Feinberg's connections back to the former Soviet Union were the core of his operational power. He had maintained relationships with figures in the Russian criminal world, and through those relationships, he had access to something that almost no other criminal operator in the United States possessed in the early 1990s, genuine, functional connections to people within the deteriorating Russian military establishment who were willing to sell military hardware. Think about what that means. Think about what it meant in 1993, 1994, 1995 as the Russian military continued to decay, as soldiers went unpaid for months at a time, as base commanders looked at equipment they were supposed to be maintaining with budgets that had been cut to almost nothing, and asked themselves very quietly what exactly they were supposed to do. Into that quiet question, Feinberg arrived with an answer. And that answer was, I know people who will pay. He had already brokered some smaller deals, military equipment, weapons components, items that were illegal to export but small enough to move without the kind of attention a submarine would attract. Each successful deal built his credibility within the network. Each transaction made the next, larger transaction more conceivable. Feinberg was also, and this is crucial to understand, genuinely likable to the Russian military figures he was dealing with. He spoke their language, literally in Russian. He understood their culture. He understood their pride, their frustration, their sense of humiliation at the way the post-Soviet transition had treated people who had given their lives to a military establishment that was now treated as an embarrassing relic. He knew how to talk to them. He knew how to make them feel respected. That human skill, that ability to read people, to give them what they emotionally needed in order to feel comfortable doing business, was as important to his criminal operation as any specific connection or resource he possessed. But Feinberg alone couldn't build the bridge to the Cali cartel. For that, he needed a specific kind of intermediary. He needed someone who could move between the Russian world, the American law enforcement world as a navigator around it, and the Latin American criminal world. He needed someone who understood all three of those universes from the inside. He needed Juan Almeida. Juan Almeida's story is in some ways more complicated than Feinberg's, because the layers of his loyalty and his operational role are harder to separate cleanly. He occupied a space where the lines between criminal actor, intelligence asset, and self-interested operator were deliberately, and sometimes necessarily, blurred. Almeida was Cuban, born in Cuba, shaped by the Cuban experience, which means shaped by a specific relationship to revolution, to state power, to the United States, and to the particular kind of political complexity that defines the lives of people who grew up in a country that has been in a state of permanent antagonism with its nearest large neighbor for over 60 years. His connections to Cuban intelligence, the Dirección de Inteligencia, known as the DI, are not something that can be stated with absolute precision in terms of the formality of his role. What can be said is that Almeida had relationships with people inside the Cuban intelligence apparatus. He had operated in spaces where those relationships were professionally useful, and those relationships gave him a particular kind of access and a particular kind of protection that a purely freelance criminal operator would not have had. Cuba's relationship with the former Soviet Union was deep, complex, and suddenly very fraught after 1991. The Soviet Union had been Cuba's primary patron, its source of economic support, military equipment, ideological solidarity, and the kind of great power backing that allowed the Cuban government to maintain its position despite the American embargo. When the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost all of that almost overnight. The Cuban economy, already strained, went into a period of severe crisis known in Cuba as the Special Period, a euphemism for genuine deprivation on a scale that affected almost every Cuban citizen. In this context, Cuba had strong motivation to maintain and develop relationships with the successor networks of the former Soviet Union. Not the Russian government necessarily, but the networks, the military contacts, the intelligence contacts, the criminal contacts that had developed over decades of Soviet-Cuban collaboration. These were valuable assets in a post-Soviet world, and Cuba was not about to abandon them simply because the formal structures they had been embedded in had ceased to exist. Almeida, in this context, was a bridge. He was someone who could operate on both sides of the former Iron Curtain, connecting Russian criminal networks on one hand with Latin American criminal networks and Cuban government-adjacent interests on the other. He spoke Spanish natively and Russian with fluency. He understood the cultural codes of both worlds. He could walk into a room of former Soviet military officers and be trusted, and he could walk into a room of Latin American criminal figures and be understood. He ended up in Miami. The precise circumstances of his emigration are one of the murkier elements of his biography, and in Miami, his path crossed with Feinberg's. The exact moment of their first meeting has been described in different ways by different sources, but the substance of what brought them together is not mysterious. They were two men operating in the same criminal ecosystem in the same city, and they had complementary capabilities that made a partnership more powerful than either individual operation. Feinberg had the Russian connections. Feinberg had access to the hardware. Almeida had the language, the cultural fluency, and the Latin American criminal connections that Feinberg needed to reach the buyers. Together, they were something more formidable than either was alone. What makes Almeida particularly interesting as a character, and particularly important to the story of Operation Odessa, is the question of his principal loyalty. Was he working for himself? Was he working for the Cuban government? Was he working for both simultaneously, in a way that served his personal financial interests while also serving state interests that he genuinely believed in? These questions are not fully resolved even by the court proceedings that followed. They are part of what makes him the most enigmatic figure in the story. What is clear is that his Cuban government connections gave the overall operation a layer of state-adjacent legitimacy, or at least state-adjacent protection, that made it significantly more difficult for law enforcement to penetrate. When you're dealing with someone who may have government backing, you have to be much more careful about how you approach the investigation, because the political dimensions can intervene in ways that purely criminal investigations don't encounter. Almeida's role in the submarine deal, specifically, was as translator and dealmaker in the negotiations with the cartel side of the transaction. He was the one who could sit across from cartel representatives and speak their language, explain the technical details of what was being offered, negotiate terms in a way that the cartel would find credible. He was, in the language of criminal operations, the front man on the buyer side, the person who made the deal intelligible and trustworthy to the people who were going to write the check. But there was a third figure in this story, a man who represented the direct line to the buyer, the Cali cartel itself. And without this man, the deal never gets discussed at all. The Cali cartel, in the early to mid-1990s, was arguably the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world. The Medellin Cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, had been the dominant force in Colombian cocaine trafficking through the 1980s, violent, operationally bold, willing to engage in direct conflict with the Colombian state in ways that included the assassination of police officers, judges, politicians, and presidential candidates. But Escobar's war on the Colombian state ultimately proved his undoing. He was killed in December 1993. The Cali cartel had always operated differently. Where the Medellin cartel was flamboyant and violent in its confrontations with authority, the Cali organization was more businesslike, more calculated, more focused on corrupting institutions rather than destroying them. The Cali leadership, the Rodriguez Orihuela brothers, Miguel and Gilberto, and their associates, cultivated a public image as respectable businessmen. They donated to civic organizations. They maintained relationships with politicians through bribes rather than threats. They projected an image of being a different kind of organization, and they were extremely successful at it. By the mid-1990s, the Cali cartel controlled somewhere between 70 and 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. They had moved approximately 250 tons of cocaine in a single year. They had banking relationships, they had political connections, and they had billions of dollars in assets spread across legitimate and illegitimate enterprises. At this level of operation, the Cali cartel was constantly looking for ways to improve its logistics. Specifically, its ability to move cocaine from Colombia to the United States and Europe without interdiction by law enforcement. The maritime route was the primary one, and maritime interdiction by the U.S. Coast Guard and the DEA was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Semi-submersible vessels, homemade submarines designed to run just below the surface, were already being used by some Colombian trafficking organizations. But those were crude, custom-built vessels with limited range and significant operational risk. A real submarine was a different proposition entirely. A real submarine, specifically a diesel-electric Soviet-era submarine designed for military operations, could travel submerged for extended distances, was virtually invisible to conventional radar and most Coast Guard detection methods, and had a cargo capacity that would dwarf anything the cartel was currently using. If the cartel could operate even a single vessel of this kind, the math of their operation changed dramatically. This was the logic that made the submarine deal conceivable to the cartel. It wasn't insane from their perspective. It was a business investment with a very clear operational rationale. Nelson Yestergarrido was the man who carried that interest from the cartel side to the table where Feinberg and Almeida were sitting. Yestergarrido was a Venezuelan-born figure with connections in both the Colombian cartel world and the Miami criminal ecosystem. His precise role within the cartel's hierarchy is one of those details that gets described differently in different accounts, but his functional role in the Operation Odessa story is consistent across sources. He was the representative, the go-between, the man who told Feinberg that there was serious interest from serious buyers. He was not a top-level cartel leader himself. He was the connector, the person who, in the language of network theory, bridged two otherwise disconnected networks. He knew people in the cartel world who were interested in acquiring a submarine. He knew people in the Miami criminal world who might be able to source one. He brought those two sides together. What made Yestergarrido's position both powerful and dangerous is that in criminal networks, the connector holds enormous leverage, because they are the only person both sides trust enough to deal through. Remove the connector and the deal collapses, which is exactly why, when law enforcement started unraveling Operation Odessa, Yestergarrido became one of the critical targets. His background included prior criminal activity in the drug world. He was not a new figure to law enforcement, though the specific contours of his Operation Odessa role were not initially known. He had operated in the South Florida criminal ecosystem long enough to know the terrain, to know who could be trusted, and to know how to have conversations about illegal things without those conversations becoming immediately usable as evidence. He was careful, but not careful enough. Nobody in this story was ultimately careful enough, because the machinery of American federal law enforcement, once it understood what it was looking at, was very, very good at finding the gaps in people's caution. 3 men, 3 different worlds, 3 different skill sets that, together, made a criminal operation of extraordinary ambition seem not just conceivable but achievable. This is what made Operation Odessa so genuinely dangerous. Not that it was the work of some exceptional criminal genius, but that it was the work of 3 ordinary human beings with the right connections in the right broken world at the right broken moment. And now, the idea itself, the submarine deal, how it went from a conversation in a strip club to a negotiation conducted in a Russian naval base. There is a version of this story where the submarine idea sounds like the kind of thing that gets discussed between drunk men at a bar, and then forgotten the next morning when sobriety returns and common sense reasserts itself. It sounds like the fantasy of people who watched too many action movies and confused their personal mythology with operational reality. Except that version is wrong. The submarine deal in Operation Odessa was not a drunken fantasy. It was a business negotiation that proceeded through multiple stages, involved multiple parties, included site visits to actual military installations, and got far enough along that serious money was being discussed in serious terms by people who intended to follow through. To understand how this was possible, you have to understand what was available in the former Soviet military infrastructure by the mid-1990s. The Soviet Navy, at its peak, was one of the most formidable naval forces in the world. It operated nuclear submarines, conventional submarines, surface combatants, and a range of support vessels on a scale designed to contest American naval dominance in every ocean. The Soviet submarine fleet in particular was vast, hundreds of vessels of multiple classes, ranging from nuclear-armed ballistic missile submarines to smaller diesel-electric attack submarines used for coastal defense and surveillance. When the Soviet Union collapsed, this fleet did not simply disappear. The vessels still existed. Many of them were still physically at their berths in naval bases in Russia, in Ukraine, in Estonia, in Latvia, in other newly independent former Soviet states. The question was what happened to them. The answer, in many cases, was not much. The budgets for maintenance essentially stopped. The crews were reduced or eliminated. The bases themselves fell into disrepair as the Russian military establishment, dealing with every other crisis of the post-Soviet transition, struggled to manage an infrastructure that had been built for a superpower budget and was now running on a drastically reduced one. Diesel-electric submarines of the Foxtrot class, the specific type that became central to the Operation Odessa negotiations, were among the vessels in this deteriorating inventory. The Foxtrot class was a Soviet design from the 1950s, later upgraded, that had been produced in significant numbers and deployed across the Soviet Navy. They were conventional submarines, diesel-powered, with electric motors for running submerged without nuclear weapons. They were military vessels designed for patrol, surveillance, and anti-shipping operations, with a displacement of about 2,000 tons submerged and a range of substantial operational radius. Crucially for the cartel's purposes, they were big enough to carry significant cargo, they were designed to operate submerged for extended periods, and they were military-grade vessels capable of evading the kind of detection that civilian vessels or homemade narco-submarines could not. And in the mid-1990s, there were people within the Russian military establishment who were willing to discuss their sale. Not the Russian government, not formally, not officially, but individual officers, base commanders, people with access to vessels and the authority, or the audacity to claim the authority, to negotiate their disposition, who were looking at their personal financial situation, at soldiers who hadn't been paid in months, at equipment rusting at docks, and who decided that the unofficial economy had more to offer them than loyalty to an institution that no longer seemed capable of loyalty in return. Feinberg understood this ecosystem because he had been navigating it through smaller deals for years. He had the contacts. He knew which officers could be approached and how. He knew the price of a conversation and the price of a commitment. And when the question came to him, from the cartel side through Yester Garrido, about whether something larger was possible, Feinberg knew the answer was yes. The figure that emerged from the negotiations was approximately $5.5 million for the submarine. In the context of the Cali cartel's finances, $5.5 million was a small number. The cartel was moving hundreds of millions, potentially billions, in cocaine revenues annually. $5.5 million was a line item, an operational expense, a capital investment. If the submarine enabled them to move even a modest quantity of additional cocaine without interdiction, it would pay for itself in a single run. Consider the math. A ton of cocaine at wholesale prices in the mid-1990s United States market was worth approximately $10 to $15 million. A submarine of the size being discussed could carry somewhere between 40 and 80 tons of cargo, depending on how it was configured for the purpose. Even at the conservative end of that range, A single successful run represented revenues in the hundreds of millions of dollars. $5.5 million for the vessel that enabled that run was, from a pure business perspective, an extraordinary return on investment. This is why the deal was serious. This is why it wasn't fantasy. The cartel was not interested in owning a submarine as a status symbol or as a curiosity. They were interested in it as a logistics solution to a very specific and very expensive problem. The problem of maritime interdiction by American law enforcement. The cocaine trade is, at its operational core, a logistics business. The product is produced in Colombia. It needs to reach customers in the United States and Europe. Between Colombia and those markets lies the Caribbean, the Florida Straits, the Atlantic, the Pacific, bodies of water that American law enforcement patrols with increasing sophistication. Every improvement in interdiction capability that the DEA and the Coast Guard make represents a direct cost to the cartel's business, either in product loss to seizure or in the additional resources required to route around the interdiction. A submarine eliminates most of those costs. It is essentially invisible to surface radar. It doesn't generate the kind of infrared signature that aerial surveillance looks for. It can travel at depths that make visual observation impossible. It is, from the cartel's operational perspective, not just a vessel but a capability, a step change in their ability to move product undetected. The Cali cartel leadership, when they understood what was being proposed, was genuinely interested. Not just curious, interested in the serious operational way that large criminal organizations get interested in things that represent genuine strategic advantages. Here is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, except that it is completely documented and confirmed. Ludwig Feinberg, the Miami strip club owner, traveled to Russia to inspect military submarines on behalf of the Cali cartel. He did not do this covertly. He traveled as himself, using his own identity, and he was received by the Russian military contacts he had cultivated through years of smaller deals. He toured naval installations, real installations with real vessels, operated by real Russian military personnel who were in discussions about the unofficial disposition of their equipment. The picture that emerges from the accounts of these visits is extraordinary in its specificity and its cognitive dissonance. Feinberg, in his descriptions of these visits, and he has been remarkably voluble in interviews after his legal proceedings, conveys an atmosphere that was simultaneously entirely mundane and completely surreal. There are Russian naval officers in uniform. There are submarines at the dock, real, full-size military submarines, still floating, still technically operational. There are conversations about price, about delivery logistics, about what exactly the buyer would be getting. The soldiers guarding these installations had not been paid. Some of them had not been paid for months. The base facilities were deteriorating. The cafeteria food was poor. The equipment that was supposed to be maintained was not being maintained because the budget for maintenance had effectively ceased to exist. And here was Feinberg, the man from Miami, representing buyers with $5.5 million and a very specific operational need. It is important to sit with the atmosphere of those meetings for a moment, because they represent something that the Cold War, which had just ended, had made seemingly unthinkable. The entire logic of the Cold War was mutual deterrence. The idea that both superpowers were so committed to their own security and so capable of destroying the other that the possibility of Soviet military hardware being casually offered for sale to a drug cartel was not even a threat scenario that Western intelligence had seriously modeled. And yet there it was. Not a hypothetical, not a war game scenario, an actual set of negotiations in an actual Russian naval installation with actual vessels available for the right price. The specific submarine on the table in the most advanced phase of negotiations was described as a Foxtrot-class diesel submarine. It was still functional or could be made functional with some investment in maintenance. It was being offered with its crew, which was one of the more remarkable elements of the deal. The Russian officers who were negotiating the sale were not just talking about delivering a vessel. They were talking about delivering a vessel crewed by Russian submariners who would operate it, train the cartel in its use, and provide the technical expertise that the cartel absolutely could not provide for themselves, because no cartel member had the faintest idea how to operate a military submarine. This detail, the crew, tells you how far the deal had progressed. You don't start discussing crew arrangements in the early, speculative stages of a negotiation. You discuss crew arrangements when you are getting close enough to agreement that the operational details matter. The submarine was the central piece of the deal. But it was not the only piece. Feinberg was also negotiating in parallel for military helicopters. The cartel wanted helicopters for surveillance operations, to monitor law enforcement movements in Colombia, to provide overwatch for their ground transportation, and to add a tier of aerial capability to their already extensive operational infrastructure. Military helicopters in the post-Soviet Russian arsenal were also available through the same kind of unofficial channels that Feinberg was working. The contacts he had cultivated could move smaller hardware as well as larger vessels. And the cartel, having established a relationship with Feinberg through the submarine negotiations, was interested in expanding that relationship to include additional military hardware. The helicopters were, in some ways, the more achievable part of the deal, smaller, more easily transported, more easily concealed in the paper trail of an international transaction. But they were also part of what made the overall operation so alarming to the federal agents who were beginning to understand its scope. This was not just drug trafficking. This was the arming of a criminal organization with military-grade equipment from the former Soviet arsenal. The implications went far beyond the narcotics trade. The question that the law enforcement community asked itself throughout the investigation, and that historians and journalists have asked since, is, how close did this actually get? The honest answer is very close. By the time federal investigators had assembled enough information to begin their active operation against Feinberg and his associates, the submarine deal was not in the fantasy stage. It was in the logistics stage. Money was being discussed not just in terms of price but in terms of transfer mechanism, how the $5.5 million would actually move from the cartel's accounts to the Russian military contacts who would release the vessel. Delivery logistics were being discussed. How to get a military submarine from a Russian naval base, through international waters, to a location in the Caribbean or the Gulf of Mexico where the cartel could take possession and begin using it. This is an enormously complex logistical problem, requiring false documentation, routing through jurisdictions with limited monitoring capability, and a level of operational security that would have required significant ongoing resources. None of this was trivially easy. All of it was being worked on. The deal did not collapse from its own weight. It did not fail because someone got cold feet or because the logistics proved impossibly complex. It was stopped from the outside by law enforcement, operating under enormous time pressure and with far less information than they needed, but with just enough to act before the final stages were completed. How they got there, how a handful of federal agents penetrated one of the most audacious criminal conspiracies in American history, is a story that begins with a single informant and a single overheard conversation and unfolds over months of some of the most difficult undercover work in DEA history. Federal investigations never begin with the full picture. They begin with a single thread, a piece of information that is incomplete, that raises more questions than it answers, that requires months or years of careful, painstaking work to develop into something that can be acted on. The investigation that became Operation Odessa was no different. The exact origin of the first intelligence that pointed law enforcement toward Feinberg's submarine negotiations has been described in different ways in different accounts, and some of the specific details remain protected by ongoing national security considerations. What can be said is that by the early to mid-1990s, both the DEA and the FBI had begun developing intelligence on the Russian mob operations in South Florida, of which Feinberg's strip club was a known, if not fully understood, component. Porky's was on law enforcement's radar not initially as a weapons trafficking hub, but as a location associated with known criminals. The club's role as a gathering point for South Florida's criminal ecosystem was the kind of thing that shows up in surveillance reports and informant tips over time, not as a specific allegation of a specific crime, but as background noise that says, something is happening here, and we don't yet know what. The shift from background noise to active investigation came when someone with direct knowledge of Feinberg's operations provided specific enough information about the scope of what he was doing that the DEA and FBI decided to commit serious resources to understanding it. Informants in criminal investigations occupy a morally complex position. They are, by definition, people who are themselves involved in criminal activity, because the only people who have direct knowledge of serious criminal conspiracies are people who are part of those conspiracies. The federal government's use of criminal informants is a necessary element of criminal investigation, but it comes with significant complications. The reliability of the information, the motives of the informant, who is typically providing information in exchange for favorable treatment in their own legal situation, and the difficulty of corroborating what the informant says without revealing that you have a source inside the organization. In the Operation Odessa investigation, the early informant information was specific enough to establish the basic shape of what Feinberg was doing, but not detailed enough and not corroborated enough by independent evidence to support a criminal prosecution, which meant the investigators had to go deeper, and going deeper meant going undercover. The Drug Enforcement Administration was the lead agency on the narcotics aspects of the investigation, which was the majority of it, at least initially. The submarine and weapons components complicated the jurisdictional picture significantly, bringing in FBI and eventually national security considerations that required coordination across multiple agencies. But it was the DEA that first committed to the deep undercover operation that would ultimately produce the evidence needed to make arrests. DEA undercover operations in this period were, by any objective assessment, extraordinarily dangerous. An undercover agent is a person who has adopted a false identity and is attempting to penetrate a criminal organization by convincing its members that they are themselves a criminal, while simultaneously documenting the criminal activity they observe and providing intelligence back to their handlers. If the undercover agent is identified as law enforcement, at any point in any interaction, the consequences can be lethal. Criminal organizations, and particularly the intersection of Russian organized crime and Colombian cartel networks that Operation Odessa involved, were not squeamish about violence. The undercover approach used in the Feinberg investigation was to introduce an agent into Feinberg's orbit through the network of people who frequented Porky's and the broader South Florida criminal ecosystem. The cover identity had to be credible enough to withstand the kind of informal vetting that experienced criminals do automatically, checking whether your story holds together, whether your claimed contacts can be verified, whether your behavior is consistent with what you claim to be. This kind of vetting is not formal. It does not involve background checks in the traditional sense. It involves observation, watching how a person behaves in various situations, noticing inconsistencies in their story, reading the signals that people who spend their lives in criminal environments learn to read very carefully. An experienced criminal like Feinberg was very good at this. He had survived in a world where misreading people had fatal consequences. He trusted his instincts, and his instincts had generally served him well. Getting a credible operative close enough to Feinberg to observe the submarine negotiations from the inside required patience, careful cover story construction, and an understanding of the specific ecosystem that Feinberg operated in. It also required luck, the particular chemistry of a social environment that causes people to drop their guard at the right moment. Alongside the undercover operation, investigators were building a parallel intelligence architecture around Feinberg and his associates. This included physical surveillance, tracking movements, photographing meetings, documenting who was present at Porky's on which nights and who they were seen with. It included financial investigation, tracing the flow of money through Feinberg's declared business interests and attempting to identify the undeclared ones. And it included electronic surveillance, wire intercepts, which require separate judicial authorization and represent one of the most powerful investigative tools available to federal law enforcement. The wire intercepts were central to the case for a specific reason. Feinberg, despite his flamboyant public persona, was careful in his explicit verbal communications about the most sensitive aspects of his operations. He understood the risk of being overheard. He had built his criminal career in part on the skill of communicating criminal intent without using criminal language, using implication, shared understanding, coded references, the kind of communication that is intelligible to participants and deniable to outsiders. But no one is perfect, and in extended conversations over an extended period, even careful people say things that are more explicit than they intend. The wire intercepts in the Feinberg investigation produced, over time, recordings that corroborated the undercover agent's observations and added specific details about the submarine negotiations that the agents couldn't have obtained any other way. The recordings were also, in many ways, remarkable documents of how the criminal world sounds from the inside. Feinberg in conversation was exactly what everyone who encountered him described. Funny, expansive, charismatic, the kind of person who makes conversation feel easy and natural. And embedded within that natural, easy conversation were references to submarine specifications, to cartel contacts, to the logistics of delivering a Soviet military vessel, all delivered in the same casual, relaxed tone that he used to talk about anything else. This quality, the absence of any audible distinction between legitimate and criminal conversation, is part of what made Feinberg so difficult to prosecute on the basis of informant testimony alone. Because you could imagine a defense attorney arguing that the informant had misunderstood the context of a conversation, that what sounded like criminal planning to a law enforcement informant was actually something else entirely. The recordings removed that ambiguity. When Feinberg discusses the technical specifications of a Soviet submarine and the price the cartel is willing to pay, there is no interpretive ambiguity. The words mean what they mean. One of the moments that fundamentally changed the character of the investigation occurred when the agents and their supervisors understood that what they were dealing with was not, at its core, a drug trafficking case. It was a national security case. A drug trafficking operation, however large, has a certain kind of contained impact. Drugs are harmful, the trade is violent, the economic consequences are significant. But the harms, terrible as they are within a known range of badness. A cartel operating with a Soviet military submarine is something qualitatively different. A cartel with unrestricted undersea transportation capability could move quantities of narcotics that would dwarf their current operations. More broadly, if criminal organizations could purchase Soviet military hardware of this type, the implications extended far beyond drugs, weapons trafficking, the potential for non-state actors to acquire military-grade capabilities, the erosion of the very concept of state monopoly on military force. When this dimension of the investigation became clear to the people overseeing it, the level of urgency and the level of resources committed to it changed significantly. What had been a serious drug investigation became something that required coordination with the FBI, with the naval intelligence community, and with parts of the national security apparatus that don't typically show up in drug cases. This created both advantages and complications for the investigators on the ground. The advantages were resources, more personnel, more analytical support, more institutional attention. The complications were bureaucratic. More agencies meant more coordination requirements, more oversight, more complexity in managing the information flow between organizations that had different cultures, different priorities, and different standards for when you have enough evidence to act. The investigators working the case had to navigate all of this while simultaneously maintaining their undercover operations, managing their informants, processing the intelligence from the wire intercepts, and making real-time decisions about when to push for more evidence and when to pull the trigger on arrests. The investigation's crucial turning point came when the undercover operations and informant network produced evidence that was specific enough, corroborated enough, and current enough to establish that the submarine deal was not just being discussed as a long-term possibility but was being actively progressed toward a near-term completion. The specific moment, the recorded conversation, or the observed meeting that shifted the timeline from building the case to we need to act now, has been described in general terms but not with full specific detail in the public record. What is clear is that there was a moment at which the investigators concluded that if they did not move soon, the deal might progress to a point where stopping it became impossible. Once a submarine leaves a Russian naval base under false documentation, tracking it becomes a matter of naval intelligence rather than law enforcement. Once money has changed hands and the vessel is in international waters, the jurisdictional picture becomes enormously complicated. The window for a law enforcement response, the window during which arrests could be made with solid criminal charges on U.S. jurisdiction, was closing. The decision was made to move, and the timing of that decision would determine whether Operation Odessa went down in history as one of the most audacious criminal conspiracies ever stopped, or as one of the most catastrophic criminal successes ever achieved. One element that law enforcement learned from their surveillance that significantly increased the urgency of the timeline was how seriously the Cali cartel was taking the deal. The cartel was not passively interested, they were actively interested, in a way that suggested they had internal champions for the submarine acquisition who were pushing it as a priority. This was important intelligence for two reasons. First, it confirmed that the deal was real, that this was not an elaborate scam or a fantasy being promoted by Feinberg and Almeida to extract money from credulous cartel representatives. The cartel leadership, or at least a significant faction of it, genuinely wanted the submarine. Second, it told the investigators that if they didn't stop it from the seller's side, there might not be an opportunity to stop it from the buyer's side, because the Cali cartel had resources and connections that could potentially complete a deal even without some of the specific individuals currently involved. Feinberg was not, in other words, irreplaceable to the cartel's ambitions. He was the most obvious and currently the best positioned path to the hardware they wanted. But he was not the only conceivable path. which meant that taking Feinberg down and assuming the problem was solved was not necessarily correct. The threat was broader than any single individual. This understanding shaped the investigation's endgame, the need not just to arrest the individuals involved, but to disrupt the entire network sufficiently that the deal could not be reconstituted by the remaining players with new intermediaries. In any undercover investigation of this scale and duration, one of the most important and least publicly discussed elements is the management of the human beings who are providing the critical intelligence. Whether they are undercover agents operating under false identities or criminal informants providing information from within the conspiracy, these individuals are under sustained psychological pressure of a kind that is very difficult to overstate. An undercover agent in a criminal organization cannot drop their cover when they leave work. There is no leaving work. They are their cover identity around the clock, in every interaction with anyone associated with the investigation's targets. The mental discipline required to maintain this over a period of months, to be consistently who you are pretending to be, to never make a verbal slip, to always have an answer for the questions that arise spontaneously in conversation, is extraordinary, and it takes a genuine toll on the people who do it. Criminal informants face a different kind of pressure. They are typically people who are themselves under legal jeopardy, facing charges, facing prison time, and who have agreed to provide information in exchange for some form of leniency. They live with the constant awareness that if the criminal organization they are informing on discovers what they are doing, the consequences will not be legal. They also live with the moral complexity of betraying people who, whatever their criminal activities, trusted them. The Operation Odessa investigation lasted long enough and involved enough human sources that the human cost of the operation was real. These are not abstract considerations. They are part of the actual history of how the case was built and what it required of the people who built it. By the period that law enforcement had internally designated as the active pre-arrest phase of the investigation, the surveillance picture on Feinberg, Almeida, and Yestergarrido was comprehensive enough to support prosecution on multiple charges. The wire intercepts had produced recordings of explicit discussions about the submarine deal. The undercover operations had produced testimony about meetings in which deal terms were discussed. The financial investigation had traced money flows that corroborated the criminal conspiracy. The physical surveillance had documented meetings between the principals and their contacts on both the Russian military side and the cartel side. It was, in the terminology of federal prosecution, a strong case. Not an airtight case, no case ever is, but a case with multiple independent strands of evidence that all pointed in the same direction, corroborating each other in ways that would be very difficult for a defense attorney to explain away. The question was no longer whether there was enough evidence to arrest. The question was whether the right moment had arrived, the moment when the arrests would be most effective at disrupting the overall network, when the evidence picture was most complete, and when the operational risk of waiting any longer outweighed the potential additional evidence that more time might produce. That moment arrived, and when it did, the machinery of federal law enforcement, the arrest warrants, the coordinated teams, the precise timing of simultaneous actions designed to prevent anyone from warning anyone else, moved with the speed and precision that years of patient preparation had made possible. Federal takedowns of major criminal conspiracies are almost never spontaneous. They are planned with military precision over weeks or months, with every element, timing, location, personnel assignments, contingencies worked out in advance. The Operation Odessa arrests were no exception. The coordination required was substantial. The targets were in different locations. Feinberg was in Miami, in or around his usual operational environment. Almeida was accessible but had to be located and secured in a way that prevented him from making any communications that could warn others. Yestergarrido's location and movements had been tracked with sufficient precision to plan his arrest as part of the coordinated action. The arrests happened in 1994, though the investigation had begun years earlier and the full case against all parties would take additional years to fully prosecute. The specific coordination of the Miami arrests involved DEA agents, FBI personnel, and support from local law enforcement, the kind of multi-agency operation that requires careful advance planning to ensure that no target is alerted by the arrest of another before all parties are in custody. Feinberg, by multiple accounts of the arrest, was taken at a moment and in a manner that he did not anticipate. This is almost always the case in well-planned federal arrests. The entire point of the surveillance and the care taken in planning the arrest moment is to ensure that the target does not have the opportunity to destroy evidence, flee, or make communications that could alert associates. The image of Feinberg at the moment of his arrest, the loud, charming, larger-than-life strip club owner in Miami who had been negotiating the purchase of a Soviet military submarine, is one of those moments where the gap between persona and reality becomes visible in a way that is simultaneously absurd and deeply serious. When the arrests were made and the initial processing began, the evidence assembled by the investigation became a formal record. The wire intercept recordings, the testimony of undercover agents and informants, the financial records tracing money flows, the documentation of the site visits to Russian naval facilities, the communications with cartel representatives. Each piece of evidence, taken in isolation, could potentially be given an innocent interpretation by a sufficiently creative defense attorney. But the full picture, the accumulated weight of recordings, observations, financial records, and witness accounts all pointing in the same direction, told a story that had no innocent interpretation. The charges filed against the principals reflected the full scope of what the investigation had uncovered. Drug trafficking conspiracy was the core charge. The connection to the Cali cartel's cocaine operations was the foundation of the federal jurisdiction. But the weapons charges, the attempt to broker the sale of military equipment, added a layer of severity that distinguished this from a standard drug case. In federal criminal law, conspiracy charges are powerful precisely because they don't require that the conspiracy succeed in order to be criminal. The act of agreeing to commit a crime and taking steps in furtherance of that agreement constitutes the criminal offense regardless of whether the ultimate objective was achieved. The submarine never left Russia. The deal was never completed. But the conspiracy to complete it, the planning, the negotiations, the site visits, the cartel negotiations, the money discussions, all of that was criminal and all of it was documented. When the arrests were announced and enough information was made public to give the media the basic shape of the story, the response was exactly what you would expect when a story involves a Russian mob boss in Miami, a Cuban spy, the Cali cartel, and a Soviet military submarine. It was enormous. The story had every element that makes crime journalism compelling to a mass audience. It had exotic characters. It had an almost unbelievable premise. It had the specific texture of post-Cold War anxiety, the fear that the collapse of the Soviet Union had produced not just freedom but also an unprecedented proliferation of military hardware into the global criminal market. It had Miami, which in the 1990s was still carrying the specific glamour and danger that had been established by the cocaine era of the 1980s. Reporters who covered the story found it almost too good to be true, and the challenge for serious journalism covering it was demonstrating that it was, in fact, true. That required anchoring every sensational element to documented fact, to court records, to on-the-record sources. And the documented facts were, if anything, more extraordinary than the rumors. The international reaction was more muted, particularly from the Russian side. The Russian government's official response to the revelation that Russian military personnel had been involved in negotiations to sell a military submarine to a drug cartel was essentially to minimize it, to treat it as the unauthorized action of individual bad actors rather than as evidence of a systemic problem with post-Soviet military security. This was diplomatically convenient, though it left many of the larger questions about the security of former Soviet military assets unanswered. The Cuban dimension of the case, specifically the question of how deeply Cuban government intelligence was involved in Almeida's activities and whether the Cuban government had any institutional awareness of or involvement in the Operation Odessa conspiracy, was one of the most politically sensitive aspects of the case. American prosecutors were understandably cautious about the Cuban intelligence angle for several reasons. First, it was genuinely difficult to establish what Almeida's precise relationship with Cuban intelligence was at the operational level, whether his connections to the DI represented active state direction or simply personal relationships that he had maintained from a prior period of state service. Second, making formal allegations about Cuban government involvement in a conspiracy with a Colombian drug cartel had significant diplomatic and political implications that went well beyond the criminal case. The formal charges and proceedings focused on the criminal conspiracy itself rather than on the geopolitical dimensions of Cuban intelligence involvement. This was a practical decision that allowed the prosecution to maintain focus on what they could prove beyond a reasonable doubt, rather than getting drawn into geopolitical arguments that would be harder to resolve in a criminal courtroom. But the questions about Cuba's role, and whether that role was ever fully exposed, are ones that serious analysts of the case have continued to raise. They are part of what makes Operation Odessa not just a crime story but a story about the geopolitical aftermath of the Cold War. One of the questions that the public and the media inevitably asked, and that the trial proceedings did not fully answer, was, what happened to the specific submarine that was being offered for sale? The submarine did not leave Russia. It remained in the naval installation where it had been during the negotiations. But what happened to it subsequently is less clear. The Russian government, in the aftermath of the Operation Odessa case, was not forthcoming about the specific disposition of the vessel. Given the general trajectory of the former Soviet Navy's inventory through the 1990s, some vessels were scrapped, some were sold through official channels to foreign governments for legitimate uses, museum ships, training platforms, and some simply continued to deteriorate at their docks. The fate of this specific vessel has not been publicly confirmed in a way that allows a definitive statement about where it ended up. What can be said is that the specific criminal transaction was stopped, and the vessel was never delivered to the Cali cartel. Beyond that, the story of the submarine itself disappears into the murk of post-Soviet military inventory management, which is itself a story worth telling, though not the one we're telling here. Federal criminal prosecution in the United States is a long, slow, deliberate process. Unlike the dramatic compressed timelines of television crime dramas, real federal cases often take years from arrest to final sentencing, years during which evidence is assembled into formal records, defense attorneys challenge every piece of it, plea negotiations proceed in parallel with trial preparation, and the human beings at the center of the case live in a kind of legal limbo. The Operation Odessa prosecutions were no exception to this pattern. The arrests in the mid-1990s began a legal process that extended through the end of the decade and into the 2000s. Different defendants resolved their cases at different times and through different mechanisms. And the ultimate outcomes, the sentences handed down, the cooperation agreements negotiated, reflected the specific choices each individual made about how to respond to the evidence against them. Feinberg's case was the most watched and the most complex, because Feinberg himself was the most central figure in the overall conspiracy, and because his personality made him a compelling presence in any legal proceeding. The charges against Feinberg were substantial. Drug trafficking conspiracy, specifically related to the operations connections to the Cali cartel's cocaine distribution network, was the primary charge. There were additional charges related to the weapons brokering activities. The potential sentence exposure on these charges, if convicted at trial on all counts, was significant, the kind of sentence that focuses the mind of any defendant contemplating whether to fight or to cooperate. Feinberg ultimately made the calculation that cooperation was in his best interest. He entered into a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors, providing information about his criminal network, his Russian military contacts, his dealings with cartel representatives, and the broader landscape of post-Soviet military hardware trafficking that his operations had exposed him to. Cooperation agreements in federal cases are complex instruments. The defendant agrees to provide truthful, complete information to the government about criminal activity. In exchange, the government agrees to consider that cooperation in its sentencing recommendation. The key word in that arrangement is consider. The government makes no guarantee about the ultimate sentence, which is in the hands of the federal judge. But substantial cooperation, in cases where the information is valuable and the defendant follows through on the agreement, typically results in a significantly reduced sentence. Feinberg's cooperation was evidently substantial enough to produce a sentencing outcome that many observers found remarkably lenient given the severity of the charges. He received a sentence that, with the cooperation credit applied, allowed him to be released from custody and eventually to return to something approaching normal life. An outcome that would have been unthinkable if he had gone to trial and been convicted on the full indictment. After his release, Feinberg did something that is, in the history of serious organized crime, genuinely extraordinary. He started talking, publicly, extensively, on camera, to journalists, to documentary filmmakers, to anyone who was interested in the Operation Odessa story. He appeared in the 2018 Netflix documentary about the operation. He has given interviews describing in considerable detail the mechanics of what he was doing, how the submarine deal developed, who the players were, and what the experience of the undercover operation and subsequent prosecution felt like from his perspective. He does this with the same charm, the same humor, the same engaging quality that made him a successful criminal operator in the first place. It is, to put it plainly, remarkable. Most serious criminals who have been through a federal prosecution emerge from the experience with a very strong desire not to discuss what happened. Feinberg seems to have emerged with the opposite impulse. Whether this reflects genuine openness, calculated image management, the simple fact that his cooperation agreement requires him to be truthful when he speaks about these matters anyway, or simply the irreducible force of his personality, it is one of the stranger features of the Operation Odessa story's aftermath. Almeida's legal proceedings followed a different path, shaped by the particular complexity of his situation, the Cuban intelligence connections, the questions about the precise scope of his participation in the conspiracy, and the geopolitical dimensions that complicated the straightforward application of criminal law. The charges against Almeida focused on his role in the drug trafficking conspiracy and in the facilitation of the submarine negotiations. His cooperation with prosecutors was also part of his legal resolution, though the terms differed from Feinberg's in ways that reflected both the different nature of his knowledge and the different nature of his exposure. The Cuban dimension of his case remained, throughout the legal proceedings, a subject of considerable sensitivity. The government's handling of that dimension, specifically the decision not to make formal allegations about Cuban state involvement in the prosecution, meant that some of the most interesting questions about Almeida's background and his full operational context were never fully explored in open court. This left journalists, analysts, and interested observers with an incomplete picture of exactly who Almeida was working for and what the Cuban government knew. It is one of the enduring, unsatisfied curiosities of the Operation Odessa story, not because there are obvious answers that were deliberately concealed, but because the evidence on the Cuban intelligence dimension was genuinely uncertain and the prosecutorial choice not to pursue it left the question formally unresolved. Yester Garrido, as the direct link to the Cali cartel side of the conspiracy, faced charges that reflected his role as the cartel's representative in the negotiations. His cooperation value to prosecutors was significant, not because of what he knew about the submarine deal specifically, but because of his knowledge of the cartel's operations more broadly, and because any information that could be used against the Cali cartel itself was, in the mid to late 1990s, enormously valuable to American law enforcement. The Cali cartel was still a major operating target of American and Colombian law enforcement through this period. The Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers had not yet been captured. Information about the cartel's internal operations, its communication methods, its logistics networks, and its key personnel had real operational value that could be exchanged for prosecutorial consideration. The ultimate outcome of Yester Garrido's case reflects the standard federal calculus for cooperation: significant charges, reduction in exposure through cooperation credit, a sentence that allowed eventual release. The specifics are less publicly documented than Feinberg's case, in part because Yester Garrido did not subsequently become a public figure in the way that Feinberg did. In 2018, a documentary about Operation Odessa was released on streaming platforms, most prominently on Showtime, though it reached wider audiences through streaming. The documentary, directed by Tiller Russell, is one of the more remarkable documents to come out of the story, because it includes extensive on-camera interviews with Feinberg himself. Watching Feinberg in that documentary is an experience that is difficult to describe. He is funny. He is self-aware. He understands the absurdity of his own story and leans into it with an obvious enjoyment that makes him, against all reasonable expectation, likable. He is not performing repentance in the way that people who want to rehabilitate their public image usually perform it. He is telling a story, his story, with the specific pleasure of someone who knows the story is extraordinary and wants to make sure the audience appreciates exactly how extraordinary it was. What the documentary revealed that the trial proceedings had not fully explored was the texture of the operation. Not the legal facts, which were well established, but the human experience of it. What it felt like to sit in a deteriorating Russian naval base discussing the price of a submarine. What the relationship between Feinberg, Almeida, and Yester Garrido actually felt like from the inside. What the moment of arrest felt like. What the legal process felt like from the perspective of someone who had built his entire identity around being unchallengeable and was now discovering that he wasn't. The documentary is also notable for what it chose not to resolve: the questions about Cuban intelligence involvement, the full scope of what else might have been sold through channels similar to the ones Feinberg operated, the question of whether there were other deals that were never detected. These are presented as open questions rather than answered ones, which is honest, because they are. When the sentences handed down in Operation Odessa are examined, the reaction from many observers is that they seem light relative to the severity of what was planned. Feinberg received a sentence that, with cooperation credit, resulted in a prison term of approximately 7 years, and he served less than that before being released. For a man who had been the central figure in a plot to sell a military submarine to one of the world's most violent drug cartels, 7 years or less feels like a modest consequence. But federal sentencing works on the basis of specific charges, specific evidence, and specific cooperation. It does not work on the basis of the general outrageousness of what someone was trying to do. The charges that could be proved, combined with the cooperation that Feinberg provided, produced the sentence that the mathematical formula of federal sentencing guidelines yielded. The result may feel inadequate to the magnitude of the conspiracy, but it is consistent with how the system functions. The more important question, the question that Operation Odessa forces us to confront, is not about the fairness of individual sentences. It is about what the case revealed about the world and what was done and not done in response to those revelations. Operation Odessa did not happen in isolation. It happened in the context of a proliferation problem that the United States government, the international community, and the broader national security establishment were only beginning to understand in the mid-1990s, and that they were, in many ways, reluctant to discuss publicly because the scale of it was so alarming that acknowledging it fully would have caused a different kind of crisis. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the question of what happened to Soviet military hardware was, for a brief period, the most serious security concern in the world. Nuclear weapons got the most attention, and there were serious, sustained international efforts, the Nunlugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program being the most significant, to account for and secure nuclear weapons and fissile materials that might otherwise have entered the black market. These efforts were not perfect, but they represented a genuine attempt to address the most catastrophic proliferation scenario. Conventional military hardware received less systematic attention. There was no comprehensive Nunlugar equivalent for diesel submarines, for military helicopters, for shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles, for the vast inventory of conventional weapons that the Soviet military had produced over decades and that were now distributed across 15 newly independent states, hundreds of military installations, and the hands of thousands of former Soviet military personnel. How much actually went missing? The honest answer is, we don't know precisely, because one of the features of a truly chaotic transition is that the record-keeping itself collapses. Military inventories that were never fully accurate in the first place became even less reliable as the institutions responsible for maintaining them disintegrated. Units that were supposed to report up the chain of command had no chain of command to report to. Equipment that was supposed to be secured was in facilities that had ceased to be secured. Operation Odessa was one documented case of military hardware from this inventory nearly reaching a criminal buyer. The case was caught. The transaction was stopped. But the question that hung over the investigation and continued to hang over it afterward was simple and deeply unsettling. How many cases weren't caught? The Cali cartel's interest in acquiring a military submarine was not, in retrospect, a surprising development. It was the logical endpoint of a trend that had been building in drug trafficking logistics for years. Drug trafficking organizations are, above all, adaptive. They face a sustained, well-funded adversary in American and international law enforcement, and they respond to each new enforcement capability by developing new evasion methods. When surface maritime interdiction became more sophisticated, they developed semi-submersible vessels, the crude narco-submarines that began appearing in the late 1980s and 1990s and that are still being intercepted today. When aerial surveillance improved, they modified their routing and timing. When one transportation method became too risky, they shifted to another. The logical progression of this adaptive behavior, when you have billions of dollars and a strong motivation to invest in your own logistics capability, points toward the acquisition of genuine military-grade transportation technology. The cartel's interest in the Foxtrot submarine was an expression of this logic applied with maximum ambition and maximum resources. What would have happened if the deal had gone through? This is a question worth sitting with for a moment, not as a thought experiment but as a real assessment of consequences. A Colombian drug cartel operating a military-grade submarine in the Caribbean would have represented a step change in their trafficking capability. Law enforcement interdiction of submarine traffic at any scale would have required genuine naval assets. Not Coast Guard cutters, but anti-submarine warfare capabilities that are expensive, complex to operate, and not designed for law enforcement purposes. The diplomatic and legal complications of using military naval assets for drug interdiction would have been significant. More broadly, a successful transaction would have established a template proof of concept that criminal organizations could acquire former Soviet military assets of this magnitude. The next conversation in the criminal world would have been, if they could buy a submarine, what else can we buy? The stopping of Operation Odessa prevented this template from being established. It prevented the proof of concept from existing. That is its most important consequence, not the individual sentences, not the disruption of a specific criminal network, but the prevention of a demonstration that would have fundamentally changed what criminal organizations believed was possible. In the years since Operation Odessa, the Russian organized crime presence in the United States has evolved significantly from the relatively visible, relatively concentrated operation that centered on Brighton Beach in the early 1990s. The contemporary Russian criminal presence in America is more dispersed, more sophisticated, and in many ways more deeply embedded in legitimate economic structures than it was 30 years ago. The enormous wealth generated by the chaotic privatization of Russian state assets in the 1990s, the wealth of the oligarchs and their criminal counterparts, has moved through multiple layers of legitimate investment, real estate purchase, financial institution relationships, and corporate structure. The laundering of Russian criminal money through real estate, particularly in major American cities, became one of the most significant financial crime issues of the 2000s and 2010s. Shell companies purchasing luxury real estate, an opaque structure that requires little beneficial ownership disclosure, provided a mechanism for moving and legitimizing enormous sums of criminally derived funds. This is a problem that regulators and law enforcement agencies have continued to work on, with varying degrees of success. The Bratva has also evolved institutionally. It remains a genuine criminal force operating in cybercrime, in narcotics, in financial fraud, and in the kind of hybrid criminal political activity that has become increasingly characteristic of Russian organized crime. The blur between state intelligence interests, oligarchic wealth, and organized criminal activity that is one of the defining features of contemporary Russia. Operation Odessa was in many ways a product of a specific historical moment. The chaos of the Soviet collapse, the particular opportunities that chaos created, the specific geography of Miami and its Latin American connections. The Russian criminal threat today is different in character, though not less serious. It is less about selling submarines and more about compromising financial systems, conducting cyber attacks, and operating in the gray areas between state intelligence activity and organized crime where accountability is most difficult to establish. The Cali Cartel, the organization that was the buyer's side of the Operation Odessa submarine deal, did not long survive the period of the operation's unraveling. In 1995, Gilberto Rodriguez Orihuela, one of the cartel's two most senior leaders, sometimes called the chess player for his strategic intelligence, was arrested in Colombia. His brother Miguel followed months later. The arrests, which came in the context of a Colombian government crackdown on drug trafficking organizations that was itself partly the product of American pressure and assistance, effectively decapitated the Cali organization's leadership structure. The cartel did not immediately cease to exist. Criminal organizations rarely do. They are network structures, and the arrest or death of any individual node in the network is rarely by itself sufficient to collapse the entire network. But the Cali Cartel, as a coherent, centrally directed organization, did not survive the loss of its leadership. What remained fragmented into smaller successor organizations, some of which continued trafficking operations, some of which evolved into the predecessor organizations of the groups that dominate Colombian trafficking today, primarily the FARC-aligned networks and the more recent cartel structures that have emerged in the post-Cali, post-Medellin landscape. The Rodriguez-Orihuela brothers were extradited to the United States in 2004 and pleaded guilty to drug trafficking charges. They received lengthy federal prison sentences. As of the writing of this account, they remain in American custody, far older than they were when their cartel represented the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world, but alive, which is more than many of their contemporaries managed. The Cali Cartel never got its submarine. But the cocaine trade, the business the cartel was built to conduct, did not end with the cartel. It adapted, reorganized, and continued. The specific organizational structure was dismantled, but the market, the product, and the human motivation to profit from its distribution did not disappear. They never do. Federal investigations that reveal major threats to national security or public safety typically produce, in their aftermath, some kind of policy response. a tightening of regulations, an adjustment of enforcement priorities, a new legislative authority or interagency coordination mechanism designed to ensure that the same vulnerability cannot be exploited in the same way again. Operation Odessa produced some policy response, particularly in the area of interagency coordination between the DEA, the FBI, and the national security apparatus on cases that crossed the boundary between drug trafficking and weapons proliferation. The case demonstrated clearly that these two threat categories were not always separable, that drug trafficking organizations with sufficient resources would inevitably attempt to acquire the most powerful tools available to them, and that those tools might come from the collapsing military arsenals of the former Soviet Union. The Nunlugar program, which had been authorized in 1991 and focused on nuclear weapons, was not substantially expanded in response to Operation Odessa to address conventional military hardware. The conventional hardware problem continued to be addressed primarily through case-by-case law enforcement action rather than the kind of systematic inventory and security effort that the nuclear materials received. Whether this was the right policy response is a question that analysts have debated since. The argument for it is resource realism. The number of former Soviet conventional military assets was so vast that a comprehensive accounting would have been impossibly expensive and logistically impractical. The argument against it is that Operation Odessa demonstrated that even large conventional assets, whole submarines, were accessible to criminal buyers, and that the consequences of such a sale would have been genuinely catastrophic. The policy choices made in the aftermath of Operation Odessa represent a bet that specific case-by-case interdiction, combined with improved intelligence sharing, was sufficient to prevent conventional military hardware proliferation from reaching criminal buyers. The bet appears to have been mostly right. There have been no confirmed subsequent cases of criminal organizations acquiring military-grade submarine capability. But mostly right is not the same as demonstrably safe, and the unanswered questions about what may have occurred in the shadows remain genuinely disturbing. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Operation Odessa, the one that applies beyond the specific story to the general understanding of how serious criminal activity operates, is about visibility and concealment. We imagine serious crime happening in darkness, in secret rooms, in coded language, in the physical spaces of criminality, warehouses, basements, the backs of cars. We imagine criminals looking like criminals. We imagine that the scale of the criminality has a visible relationship to the character and appearance of the criminal. Operation Odessa tells a different story. The nerve center of the operation was a strip club in Miami with a funny name. The central figure was a man who made everyone he met feel welcome and entertained. The negotiations for a Soviet military submarine were conducted in conversations that, on tape, sound casual and unalarming. The most audacious criminal conspiracy in the history of South Florida was hiding in plain sight, in exactly the kind of place where you would never look for it. This is not an accident. It is a design principle. Feinberg was not hiding in a strip club because it was the best available option. He was hiding in a strip club because the strip club was itself the camouflage, because the loudness, the frivolity, the particular social atmosphere of the place created conditions in which conversations about submarines could be had without anyone who happened to overhear a fragment of them understanding what they were actually hearing. The lesson for law enforcement, and for the public understanding of how serious crime operates, is that the most dangerous things don't necessarily look dangerous. They look ordinary, or they look like entertainment, or they look like legitimate business. They look, in other words, like exactly what Porky's looked like to anyone who walked in off the street in Miami in 1993. The question that haunts serious analysts of Operation Odessa is not about this specific case. The case was caught. The submarine deal was stopped. The criminals were prosecuted. The system, in this instance, worked. The question is about the universe of similar cases. The analogous deals that were conducted through similar channels, with similar methods, by similar figures operating in the same post-Soviet chaos, but that were not caught. Not because law enforcement failed, but because they weren't there to fail in the first place. The Russian criminal networks that Feinberg operated within were not exclusively devoted to the specific deal that became Operation Odessa. Feinberg himself has acknowledged, in his various post-conviction interviews, that the Operation Odessa transaction was not his first foray into military hardware brokering. He had conducted smaller deals before, transactions that were individually less alarming than a submarine but that, taken together, represented a pattern of activity that was a problem precisely because the smaller items were less likely to attract the scrutiny that a submarine eventually attracted. Consider the economics. A military helicopter is a serious piece of hardware, capable of changing the operational calculus of any criminal organization that acquires it. But a military helicopter is small enough relative to its military significance that its unofficial sale might not trigger the kind of investigation that a submarine does. The dollar amount is smaller. The logistics are simpler. The number of people who need to be involved in the transaction is fewer. The chance of interception is lower. The same logic applies across the range of post-Soviet military equipment that became available through unofficial channels in the 1990s. Night vision equipment, weapons systems, explosives, secure communication devices, body armor designed for military use. All of these items flowed through the same informal networks that Feinberg was operating in, and not all of them were intercepted. The honest assessment is, we don't know how much got through. We know how much was caught. The two numbers are not the same. The question of Juan Almeida's relationship with Cuban intelligence, and by extension, the question of whether the Cuban government had institutional awareness of or involvement in the Operation Odessa conspiracy, remains one of the most formally unresolved aspects of the story. American prosecutors, as noted, made a deliberate choice not to pursue the Cuban state dimension formally in the criminal proceedings. This was a reasonable prosecutorial decision. You prosecute the case you can prove, not the geopolitical theory you find interesting. But it left a significant gap in the public understanding of what Operation Odessa actually was. If Almeida was operating under Cuban intelligence direction, if the DI was actively using the Operation Odessa network as a means of maintaining relationships with both Russian criminal networks and Latin American drug cartels in the post-Soviet period, then the story is not just about three criminal entrepreneurs and a crazy idea. It is about a state intelligence operation using criminal networks for geopolitical purposes. That would be a qualitatively different story, with qualitatively different implications. There is a version of the Operation Odessa story that is relatively contained. Three clever criminals with good connections nearly pulled off an extraordinary deal. Federal law enforcement caught them. Justice was served. End of story. And there is another version, not proved but also not definitively disproved, in which the conspiracy had state intelligence backing that was never fully exposed or prosecuted. The evidence for the second version is circumstantial. The circumstantial evidence is suggestive enough that serious analysts raise the question. But it is not conclusive, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that distinction. This is a question that the relevant intelligence agencies have grappled with since the Soviet collapse, and that does not have a publicly available, comprehensive answer, because the answer itself is classified, and because the full answer may not be known even to the agencies asking. What is publicly known is that the process of accounting for former Soviet military equipment was incomplete and in many areas inadequate. The nuclear materials received the most attention and the most resources, and even there, even with the focus and the international cooperation that the nuclear threat commanded, there were documented cases of material going missing, of discrepancies in inventories, of items that were supposed to be in one place appearing somewhere else. Conventional military equipment received less systematic attention, and the accounting was correspondingly more incomplete. Submarines, as large and conspicuous as they are actually among the easier items to track. They're big, they have specific locations, and their status can be monitored. The items that are most concerning from a proliferation perspective are the smaller, more easily moved, more easily concealed categories. Specialized weapons components, sensitive electronics, weapons-grade materials that fall below the nuclear threshold but above the conventional threshold. The Nunlugar program, over the 2 decades it operated, worked to secure and decommission an impressive volume of former Soviet military material. But it operated in an environment of incomplete information, partial access, and diplomatic constraints that prevented it from functioning as the comprehensive accounting that the scale of the problem theoretically required. The answer to how many Soviet assets remain unaccounted for is enough to remain a concern. And that is a deliberately vague answer, because a more specific one would require either classified information or a willingness to speculate beyond what the evidence supports. Ludwig Feinberg, in his post-conviction life, has positioned himself as the most accessible primary source on Operation Odessa. He gives interviews. He appears in documentaries. He answers questions, apparently fully, apparently with the kind of candor that his cooperation agreement requires and his personality seems to endorse. But there is a question about Feinberg's account that should be raised, not to suggest he is lying, but in the spirit of good epistemics. What does Feinberg know that he isn't saying or can't say? or has chosen to frame in particular ways that serve his own narrative interests. Feinberg is an intelligent man who spent years operating in an environment where controlling information, knowing more than the other party, revealing information selectively for strategic purposes, was a core professional skill. The idea that this skill entirely disappears when he sits in front of a camera for a documentary interview is not obvious. What he tells us about Operation Odessa is extensive and, in its essential facts, consistent with the documented record. But what he tells us is also, by definition, the version of the story that Feinberg has decided to tell. The version that presents him in the way he wants to be presented. The version that emphasizes the audacity and the humor and the extraordinary improbability of what he was doing, while not necessarily fully illuminating the human costs of the criminal networks he was part of, the drug trade violence, the suffering at the receiving end of the cocaine that the Cali cartel distributed. This is not a criticism unique to Feinberg. It is a structural feature of any account given by a participant in criminal activity who has subsequently cooperated with authorities and has a persona to maintain. The account is real. The account is also curated. The task of the serious analyst is to use it carefully, with awareness of both its value and its limitations. One of the most quietly uncomfortable questions that Operation Odessa raises is about the nature of the law enforcement response. Not the response after the case was made, which was competent and ultimately successful, but the earlier period, when a Russian mob boss was operating a strip club in Miami that served as the hub of an international criminal network involving military hardware sales to drug cartels, and American law enforcement largely didn't know. How does that happen? How does an operation of this scale and ambition operate, essentially in plain sight, for an extended period before serious investigative resources are brought to bear? The answer goes back to the structural issues discussed earlier. The FBI's focus on the Italian-American mob, the absence of Russian-speaking agents, the limited institutional knowledge of how Russian criminal networks operated. These were real constraints, not failures of individual competence. But they also reflect a broader truth about law enforcement resource allocation, which is that attention follows established priorities, and established priorities are always somewhat backward-looking. The threats that law enforcement knows how to fight are the threats that law enforcement has fought before. The novel threats, the ones that don't fit the existing templates, are the ones that take longest to recognize and respond to. The Russian mob in South Florida in the early 1990s was a novel threat. Operation Odessa was, in its specifics, unprecedented. The combination of post-Soviet military hardware, American organized crime infrastructure, and Latin American drug cartel demand was a threat configuration that nobody had specifically prepared for. That it was caught at all in the specific form it took required luck alongside skill, and the next such configuration might present in ways that made it even harder to recognize. The question of whether American law enforcement is better positioned today to recognize and respond to similarly novel threat configurations is important and not trivially answerable. The apparatus has improved. There are more resources dedicated to non-traditional organized crime, more cultural and linguistic expertise, more sophisticated approaches to the intersection of criminal and national security threats. But the fundamental challenge of novelty, of threats that don't fit existing templates, remains, and will always remain, the hardest problem in law enforcement. At the end of this story, after all the facts and the characters and the legal proceedings and the larger implications, it is worth returning to the most fundamental level, the human level. 3 men. 3 different lives that intersected in a specific historical moment. 3 sets of choices that, taken together, nearly produced a consequence that is almost too large to comprehend. Ludwig Feinberg grew up in Odessa, in the Soviet Union, in a city defined by its relationship to the sea and its irreverence toward authority. He emigrated to America, built a life in Miami, and found that the specific skills his personality had given him, the charm, the networking ability, the willingness to transgress, were more valued in the criminal world than in the legitimate one. He made choices. Each choice led to the next. The strip club led to the criminal connections. The criminal connections led to the Russian military contacts. The Russian military contacts led to the submarine. At every point, another choice was available. This is not a defense of what he did, and it is not an indictment of his character beyond what the facts already establish. It is an observation about the human experience of path dependency, how one decision shapes the field of subsequent decisions, until what seemed impossible at the beginning seems almost inevitable at the end. Juan Almeida grew up in Cuba, shaped by a revolution that promised to transform the world and produced instead a state that controlled and surveilled and restricted its own citizens while presenting to the outside world an ideology of liberation. Whatever his precise relationship to Cuban intelligence, whether he was an agent, an asset, an informal collaborator, he operated in the complicated space between state power and personal ambition that is characteristic of people who grow up inside authoritarian systems. He was not simply a criminal. He was a product of a specific historical and political formation, one that created people who had a particular relationship to loyalty, to betrayal, and to the navigation of competing interests. Nelson Yestergarrido represented the most visible face of a phenomenon that was reshaping the Americas in the 1980s and 1990s, the enormous wealth and corrupting power of the cocaine trade. He was the connection point between the supply side and the demand side, between the Russian military hardware available in the post-Soviet chaos and the cartel money willing to purchase it. He was a bridge figure in a world full of bridges between things that had previously been separate. Together, these three men almost did something that should not have been possible. Not because they were exceptional criminals, they were clever, but they were not geniuses. Not because the world was uniquely broken, the world is always broken in one way or another, but because the specific brokenness of the world in that specific moment, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise of the cocaine trade, the chaos of the South Florida criminal ecosystem, the inadequacy of early law enforcement attention created a window. Windows open. Windows close. This one closed just barely, just in time. Here is the part of this story that should stay with you after the video ends. Not the specific facts, the submarines and the strip clubs and the court proceedings. Those are fascinating, but they are history. What should stay with you is the structural insight that Operation Odessa offers about how the world works. The conditions that made Operation Odessa possible, desperate military personnel in collapsed states, criminal organizations with resources to match small governments, the intersection of drug trafficking and weapons proliferation, the adaptive intelligence of organized crime, are not gone. They are not historical artifacts. They are features of the contemporary world. There are states today whose military arsenals are less than perfectly secure, where corruption within the military establishment creates the possibility of unofficial transactions, where a soldier or officer who has not been paid might be susceptible to an offer that no ideologically committed, financially secure person would accept. There are criminal organizations today with resources vastly exceeding those of the Cali Cartel in its prime, organizations that are already thinking about logistics innovations and are already looking at every available technology for how it might serve their operational needs. There are intermediaries, people like Almeida, like Yestergarrido, operating in the gaps between criminal worlds, between national identities, between legitimate and illegitimate economies. There will always be such people as long as the gaps exist. And the gaps will always exist. The specific form that the next Operation Odessa takes will not be identical to the original. The post-Soviet military hardware availability has diminished over 30 years of Nunlugar and its successors. The specific geography of the Cali Cartel no longer exists. The Miami of the early 1990s, with its specific criminal ecosystem, has changed. But the logic of criminal innovation, of opportunity exploitation in the space created by state failure and regulatory gaps, is permanent. Operation Odessa was one expression of that logic. There will be others. The form will be different. The principle will be the same. This story is mostly told from the perspective of the criminals, because that is where the narrative drama lives, and because the criminals in this story are, despite everything, genuinely interesting people. But it should be said plainly that the federal agents who built the Operation Odessa case did something genuinely difficult and genuinely important. They worked a novel case with inadequate tools, insufficient language capability, insufficient cultural knowledge, insufficient institutional precedent, and they got it right. They built a case that held up, that produced prosecutions, that stopped a transaction that would have had genuinely catastrophic consequences. They did this over years with the sustained patience that serious federal investigations require, and with the courage that undercover operations always require. They are the reason this story is told as a near miss rather than a catastrophe, that deserves acknowledgement, separate from and before any critique of the systemic failures that allowed the conspiracy to develop for as long as it did before being detected. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed and the rules of the world changed in ways that nobody had fully prepared for. In the space that the collapsing rules created, three men had an idea. The idea was insane. The idea was also entirely rational, given the world they were operating in. The only thing that separated the idea from reality was a handful of federal agents and a set of recorded conversations. Think about how thin that line was. Think about what was on the other side of it. Then think about how many lines like that exist today. Things that didn't happen because someone was watching, someone was paying attention, someone spent years doing difficult, unglamorous, underappreciated work to ensure that the world's worst ideas stayed ideas. Operation Odessa is a story about criminals. It is also a story about the fragility of the systems we depend on to keep the most catastrophic possibilities from becoming real. And it is a story about the world that exists in the gap between the system we think we have and the reality of how things actually work. That world is still out there. It is operating right now. And the next story it produces will be just as extraordinary, just as real, and just as dependent on someone paying attention as this one was. If you made it here, to the very end of this, I want you to know that genuinely means something. This was not a short video. This was a deep dive into a story that deserved the depth. You just spent real time with Operation Odessa, and the fact that you stayed with it all the way through tells me you're exactly the kind of person this channel is built for. Before you go anywhere, drop a comment right now. Tell me the single moment in this story that hit you hardest. Was it the site visits to the Russian naval base? The detail about soldiers who hadn't been paid for months being the ones guarding the hardware? The fact that Feinberg is still out there talking about all of this openly on camera with a smile on his face? I genuinely want to know which part of this stayed with you, because those comments tell me what to go deeper on. And if you're not subscribed yet, look, you watched this whole thing. You clearly want more of exactly this kind of content. Hit the subscribe button. Turn on notifications. This story took real research, real time, and real care to put together. If it gave you something, a new understanding of how the world works, a content that felt worth your time, share it with one person. Just one person who you think would want to know this story. That's how this channel grows. That's how stories like this reach the people who should hear them. Operation Odessa. 3 men. 1 submarine. The world that made it possible. And the thin line that stopped it. Thanks for being here. See you in the next one.